So good morning, everybody. I'm very excited this morning. Before we get started, let's say prayer. I'm going to say the prayer for social justice. I feel like it gets a lot of work in our morning forums, but I think it's appropriate for our topic this morning. So let us pray. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving spirit may so move every heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, this morning I'm very excited to welcome Micah Parzen, the CEO of the Museum of Us. I'm also thrilled that it is thanks to parishioner and chapter member Rocket Ewell, who arranged whose sort of idea it was to invite Micah to come and speak with us this morning as a part of our ongoing Race in America series, which has started with the Waking Up White book study and is continuing with Sacred Ground. So we're going to try to do something quarterly to kind of keep the congregational conversation going in addition to our Sacred Ground small groups. If we have folks who were not able to be in a Sacred Ground group the last time we started a group, but are interested in starting one now, please do let me know, and we'll see if we have enough folks to get another group launch. I'll just introduce that with that, start us off with that little caveat. Micah, I will let you sort of introduce our topic this morning, and I don't think I'll need to say much other than that, than to turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff. And if you bear with me just for a moment, I will share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Excellent. I see some thumbs up. Well, again, thank you so much for having me here today. It really is an honor and quite humbling to have the opportunity to speak with all of you. As Jeff mentioned, Rocket has been a trustee on our board for many years and an amazing contributor. And I've heard a lot about you folks and what you do over the years. And I'm just happy to be able to share with you today and learn from you as well. I should say I was raised Jewish, but trained as an anthropologist. And my wife is Episcopalian, and her grandfather, Ben Riles, used to say that he never met an Episcopalian that he didn't like. And so I'm sure I will love all of you and want to honor Ben Riles in that way. I wanted to start by really lauding all of you for the journey toward equity that you are on. As you all know from firsthand experience, that journey is it's very messy, it's difficult, and it can be quite uncomfortable at times. And yet here you all are. You're here as individuals, and maybe even more importantly, you're here as a community. You know, it's easy to put up a Black Lives Matter banner, but what's not easy is doing the work and the engaging in the self-reflection and the community reflection. And so I just want to really acknowledge and express gratitude to all of you and all of you in the congregation who are engaged in this Sacred Ground process to sort of do better as you know better. Even though it's hard at times. I'd like to share today a bit about the 105-year-old journey of the Museum of Us, which, as you know, I've had the honor of serving as CEO of the museum for a little over 10 years now. And the museum sits on the ancestral homelands as does St. Paul's, and likely where every one of you is sitting right now, on the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay peoples, who have stewarded the land since time immemorial. The museum was founded in 1915 as the San Diego Museum. And it was part of and really one of the gems of the Panama, California Exposition in 1915, celebrating the opening of the Panama Canal. And it was the only museum in the park at that time. And a little known sort of fact of the beginnings of the exposition were that at the time there were Kumeyaay peoples living in the park and making their home there. And the organizers of the exposition, which had put in a bid for the World's Fair and didn't get it, but said we're gonna do it, throw a big event anyway. They deemed those indigenous peoples, the Kumeyaay, sort of insufficiently native enough from a stereotypical perspective for the throngs of visitors who were expected to come to the exposition. And so they forcibly removed them, and they brought in Native Americans from the Pueblo tribes in Arizona and New Mexico, brought them in on trucks and trains, and set up a Indian demonstration village in Balboa Park for all the visitors to sort of gawk at the baskets and the rugs and the pottery that was being made. And I think it's really important from a sort of a place-based perspective that this is the complicated, larger context of harm to indigenous peoples that the Balboa Park and eventually all of its institutions emerged out of. The museum was originally conceived of as sort of one of the great museums of the Southwest. And you can see here, museums of that time were really what we would call cabinet of curiosities, where they were just stuff that was sort of put out there in dioramas and places to engage in scholarly research and thinking and all the rest. And one of the functions of these sort of cabinets was that they really reinforced both the economic and the social rank and really the authoritative expertise of the white curators and the scholars and the collectors who had formulated and comprised the museum. In fact, that rank was really even solidified before you walked into the museum. For those of you who know the park and know the beautiful California building, which is really a homage to the colonial endeavor, etched in the facade are 9 figures. These are conquistadors and missionaries. And from a Kumeyaay perspective and an indigenous perspective, these are the very folks who came in and sort of pillaged and took over and spread their way of life and brought disease and really decimated and subjugated the Kumeyaay peoples. And so this is really a site of great pain for many Kumeyaay peoples, for indigenous peoples more generally. Before they even walk into our doors, there is a real sort of feeling of not being welcome there and not feeling a sense of belonging, understandably so. The first exhibit at the museum, in fact, was called The Story of Man Through the Ages. And you can see here, it consisted of about 60 different busts that really promulgated these ideas that were prominent in the time of scientific racism, using pseudoscience and in particular the morphology of skulls. So we had Caucasoid skulls that were busts had been made out of, and Mongoloid busts and Negroid busts and so on and so forth. And there was this real indication that of a superiority of different races based on the morphology. And this kind of activity really set the stage for what was literally decades to come of mistreatment of Native and Indigenous peoples and peoples of color in the museum. And, you know, much of the time that was unintentional and unwittingly, and it was very much rooted within the locus of the time, but it ended up creating an extraordinary sense of trauma and harm for Native Indigenous peoples and peoples of color, and really calcified sort of the idea of who museums are for. And that's the story of many museums, quite honestly. If we fast forward to 2010, I came on as CEO of that time. Of course, we were called the San Diego Museum of Man. And we quickly engaged in a strategic planning process that ended up with a new mission. We had an old school sort of collect, preserve, interpret, kind of a traditional museum mission. And we changed that to inspiring human connections by exploring the human experience. And the vision was to be San Diego's dynamic place to go to learn from each other, reflect on our place in the world, and build a better community. And it really set the stage for a different effort going forward than what we had traditionally been coming out of these histories that I've been talking about. And in 2011, early on, we really had a critical turning point in our trajectory that would change us forever. And made an indelible imprint on us. And that was, we brought the exhibit, Race, Are We So Different? And for those of you who have been to the museum, you hopefully have seen it and been able to kind of dive deep into its nuances. But it had an extraordinary impact on us as an institution. We had phenomenal visitor experience that emerged out of it. And just to share one as a wonderful example, one day I was walking through the galleries and I saw an older woman who was sitting on a bench, and she had just gone through the exhibit. And I went up and introduced myself, and I asked her, would you mind telling me how you liked the exhibit? And she said, I loved it. She said, my family and I were visiting from Wisconsin, and we've always been prejudiced against people of color. That's just how we were raised. And then she said, I'm 86 years old now, and I finally get it. Race just doesn't matter that much. God put people on this earth for the same opportunity, and they should have that opportunity. Thank you so much. And it was sort of in that moment that we realized the transformative impact that we could have, particularly in the equity and inclusion space, and that we could use our exhibits and public programs to really challenge people's assumptions and try to get them to start thinking in different kinds of ways and feeling different things, walking a mile in the shoes of others, and highlighting the narratives of Indigenous peoples, of peoples of color, which are often sort of suppressed or swept under the rug, and giving space and voice to those experiences in a different kind of way. The race exhibit was is really about, it's still at the museum. It challenges the idea of race as a biological or genetic construct, and really looks at it as a cultural construct, and the ways in which that construct has been made very real through our educational and political and legal and other social institutions, and then the experience of race and racism in everyday life. And it was the kind of thing that you can't bring an exhibit like that without doing a lot of soul searching yourself. And it really set the stage for us to take a very serious look under our own hood of our own privilege and the privileged landscape of Balboa Park, within which we had been operating for decades, since 1915. One of the key realizations that we brought out of hosting and ultimately purchasing the race exhibit was the acknowledgement that we couldn't um, create and hold a space of meaningful discourse about topics such as race that are difficult to traverse. We couldn't do that for our public externally if we already weren't doing that internally as an organization. So taking a cue from Mother Teresa, who said that, you know, if you want world peace, go home and love your family. We started an initiative called World Peace Starts at Home. And World Peace Starts at Home really had 3 components to it. The first was to really think long and hard and reflect and unpack about how we treated each other as a staff, how we related to one another, how we treated each other as a board, and how we related to one another, including how the board and the staff related to one another, not as haves and have-nots, but folks working toward the same common cause, albeit in different kinds of roles. And thirdly, it really led us to reflect on how we treated the descendant communities of the cultural resources that we stewarded, and did so in perpetuity on behalf of the people of the state of California. This kind of thinking led us to a deep institutional commitment that began as sort of a small snowball, and as it went up down the hill, it gathered more and more and got larger and larger. But it was really a deep institutional commitment to own our own history of mistreatment of Indigenous peoples and other peoples of color, and to try to find ways to rebuild the trust that had been decimated through that history, and partner with Indigenous folks, in particular the Kumeyaay peoples and community here in this region, and find a path toward healing, a better way going forward. In addition to looking at bringing in Indigenous and people of color onto our staff and onto our board, we also really started to focus on language. And we started looking at a variety of things that we used in the museum that had been sort of outdated. For example, we had long referred to our work as in our storage facility as collections. And we realized over time that really privileged a scientific mentality, a kind of a taxonomical classification, and honored the people who were collecting, and the hobbyists and the anthropologists and the archaeologists. And our words have power, of course. And we went down the path of changing that to begin to call what we did cultural resources. And the things in our cultural resources, rather than artifacts and scientific specimens, we called them items and belongings, really belongings to the home communities that we had often unethically acquired those things. And we started looking at our language in a wide variety of ways and changing it, knowing that power was there. We ended up referring to instead of our storage rooms as laboratories, we just called them storage rooms. And instead of referring to mummies and shrunken heads and remains, we started calling them ancestors. And we started to imbue everything we did with this sort of respect and honor of humanizing the Indigenous peoples who were implicated in this process. We also took a long, hard look at our policies and realized that we had to make some serious changes along those lines. And one of the first things we did is we looked at the human remains policy that we had in place at the time, and we altered it to reflect something very different. We had curated mummies and human remains and shrunken heads and all the rest for decades, and it was in fact one of our most popular offerings. And we ended up coming up with a new set of policies, one that basically said we would not curate human remains unless we had informed consent of the descendant community. So we drew upon the medical practice of informed consent, and we basically took everything off display unless we have some sort of a consent in writing. We also adopted a really groundbreaking policy, which we referred to as our colonial pathways policy. That policy essentially says that anything that came into the museum's possession by way of a colonial pathway was subject to return. Colonial pathway was defined very broadly. It privileged Indigenous knowledge and essentially means that anything that has come into the museum is really open to a discussion in partnership with an Indigenous community from which it came as to whether it should be returned. And if the Indigenous community indicates that it does not want the item or the belonging to be returned, we engage in a discussion about what would a new set of terms and conditions look like for how we steward those belongings going forward. And both aspects of the policy have really been transformational for us. On the heels of looking at our language and looking at our policies, we also adopted a land acknowledgement policy that was really fundamental for our work and setting the stage for that going forward. As I did in the beginning of this discussion, we acknowledge that this is Kumeyaay land on which we're sitting, and express gratitude for the Kumeyaay peoples for stewarding it since time immemorial. This is something that we now do in our board meetings. We now do at the beginning of our committee meetings, our staff meetings as well. It's on our website with an explication of why land acknowledgements are important, how they, instead of erasing 500 years of history and trauma and harm, they very directly and explicitly sort of honor the Kumeyaay in that way, or whatever Indigenous group you may be on at any given time. We start our fundraising events with a land acknowledgement, our press interviews with a land acknowledgement, along with our public programs. And it has been a simple but extraordinarily empowering act that sort of levels the playing field, at least on one sense, to sort of get things going. The name of the museum, which actually changed to the San Diego Museum of Man in the early 40s, also emerged, of course, out of this same colonial paradigm, which is based on this idea that to the victor go the spoils, and therefore the right to extract cultural resources and environmental resources and human resources. It was a name, of course, that reflected this idea that man is a proxy for humankind and humanity, while ignoring that leaves out so many in the process. And we knew this was a problematic name for us, but yet it was so iconic in our community. When I arrived, we decided to sort of put it on the back burner, knowing, however, that we would have to address it eventually. In fact, it had been a topic of fairly serious debate in the community since the early 1990s. In 1991, a small group from the National Organization of Women called very vocally for the museum to change its name, that this was the early 90s, for Pete's sake, and it was time to recognize that many women in particular felt excluded from sort of this institution. And even up to this day, before we changed the name, it was one of the most common questions we got. When are you going to change your name? In addition to, is this a church? And can we climb your tower? And uh, it was one of those situations that the press took hold of, and the community started to engage in earnest about whether the San Diego Museum of Man should change its name. There were articles in the UT. You can see this one, the Museum of Man gets jab in the gender. And there were letters to the editor, both pro and con, that flew back and forth, and the museum received a box full of very strong opinions on both sides. Some people saying, how could you possibly? And others saying, what has taken you so long? The museum surveyed its membership widespread and ended up brainstorming hundreds of, probably a couple hundred names of what the museum could possibly be changed to, what the name could be changed to. And after sort of doing the linguistic research and researching what other similarly situated anthropology museums had called themselves and their thinking, and hearing from the membership, the board and executive staff at the time decided to keep the name, keep the name the same. Fast forward to 2017, and the board of trustees at the museum decided that, the world around us had changed so much in the intervening period since the early 90s. And yet the name of the museum still hadn't changed. And as we had grown more and more into our anti-racism work, into our decolonizing initiatives work, and made significant progress along those lines, knowing, of course, that we still had so much to do, we decided as a community, and the board approved us pursuing a name change process in earnest again. And we started that by creating a series of focus groups. And again, we brainstormed anew possible names. We had many different groups come together, and we got input from a wide swath of the community. And about 5 or 6 names sort of continuously rose to the top, and we decided we would test those. We sent out a survey to thousands and thousands of people. And as you can see here in this slide, we also installed a sort of pop-up exhibition in the rotunda of the museum, where every week during a busy summer, we tested individual names and got a wide variety of perspectives. We had a very prickly reaction to it. It wasn't all that different, quite honestly, than what happened in 1991. And there were many people who were sort of caught off guard and couldn't believe that we would consider doing that. It was at a time when it was 2017, 18, and President Trump was sort of just getting the wheels in motion on a lot of his initiatives. And it very much tapped into a ethos of anxiety that pervaded, what turned out obviously to be years up to this day. But I even got sort of angry calls from philanthropists saying that I had better watch my back, and that, museum directors come and go, and the next one will just change the name back anyway. We were a little bit sort of stunned by the reaction. And in retrospect, I see it as I wish I could have a do-over in terms of how we sort of paved the way for the discussion. I wish I had started by saying we're thinking about changing our name, And this is why, and what do you think? And sort of letting the community acclimate to that. Instead, we said, we're planning on changing our name, and here's 6 names we're considering, and what do you think? And it was a little bit too much change too quickly for the community. We were sort of trying to figure out what we were going to do next when the city announced a enormous seismic retrofit project of the California Tower. And it was an all hands on deck sort of situation. We put the project of the name change on pause. And quite honestly, we thought that it would likely be 3, 4, if not 5 years down the road that we would actually change our name. I even thought that, maybe, it was just going to be too hard to change it, and that it would be somebody else's problem at some point down the road. And it wasn't a mantle I wanted to take up at that point. But then, of course, in mid-March of this year, our world's changed forever. And we were forced to close the museum to the public for the next 6 months, as it turned out. And we opened for a stint and now are closed again as we're in the purple tier. And our focus really became on how do we best serve community need during this challenging time. In early April, I came upon an article by a woman named Arundhati Roy, who you may be familiar with. She wrote in the Financial Times an article called "The Pandemic is a Portal." And in it, she asked, quote, "What is this thing that has happened to us? It is definitely more than a virus. Our minds are longing for a return to more normality. But in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. The pandemic is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and our hatred, our avarice, and our dead ideas. Or we can walk through it lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And inspired by Roy's words, I set out to convince our team and our board that now is the time. Let's just go for it. Let's imagine a new world together based on what we have already built, and let's be ready to fight for it. And after countless spirited discussions in a wide variety of formats about everything from the decision to change the name to our process, to the name itself, and to our execution, the board finally agreed with just one trustee voting against the name change. We announced the Museum of Us as our new name on August 2nd, 2020, along with a new branding system. And the San Diego Union Tribune broke the news with here's our new branding system, with over 150 news outlets, both in the United States and abroad, picking the story up. And the response was absolutely overwhelming. We really received a groundswell of support and love, with hundreds of comments, emails, letters, lauding us and expressing great gratitude for our decision at this difficult time. The writers of these comments, emails, and letters shared stories about how our new name was, quote, "one of the best feel-good stories I've read this year," end quote, and how it gave them, quote, "hope for the possibility that the people in the US and world can do this kind of introspective thinking about race and gender issues and set about fixing them." They also shared that they loved our, quote, "commitment to creating a living tribute to our shared humanity," end quote. And they communicated that it gave them a, quote, "jolt of happiness" when they read the news, and that it was, quote, "a beautiful tribute to us all," and, quote, "exactly the message we need to send to the world today." They shared how much they appreciated, quote, "organizations taking wise, inclusive, and transformative reforms to right any past transgressions, and that the name change, quote, represents yesterday, today, and tomorrow, that it's every innovation and every possibility shown with light and appreciation. And they felt that, quote, we can change, we can grow and learn with and through these times together. And that, quote, the beauty and the pain of humanity, along with what it will take to heal individually and as a collective. We even had one donor reach out to ask us how much it would cost to name a wing of the Museum of Us in honor of her grandmother, who had recently passed away. One of the many news outlets that picked up the story, however, was Breitbart. And soon after, Tucker Carlson and Fox News featured the name change in a national news segment, which aired an interview that I had done with a local news station. Tucker lambasted the name change as political correctness run amok, and yet another example of cancellation, woke culture at its worst. And along with his colleague, he decried it as erasing our common history. And they proclaim that there is nothing more universal than the word man. Soon after, as you can imagine, there was a juggernaut in motion. And we received a barrage of emails and voicemails that were filled with hate and vitriol. Clearly, we had touched a nerve in the national consciousness about how and why language matters. And many people, including some of our donors, reached out to say they would never visit nor support the museum ever again. In the beginning, my mantra was, I will not read the comments. I will not read the comments. I will not read the comments. But I soon realized that I had to understand what people were saying in social media and elsewhere. And I had to remember that they saw the world through a very particular lens that was ground through their own experience and how they were positioned in the world, and how important it was to embrace their humanity as if it were my own, despite their hate. And I had to remind myself to hold a space for them and to love them too. Otherwise, we ran the grave danger of the Museum of Us becoming a museum of us versus them, which was the antithesis to what we're all about as an institution. Our name change was really a process, a test of holding empathetic space at so many points along the way. It required holding an empathetic space for our staff who believed that a change was necessary and they had input, but they didn't have decision-making authority regarding the new name. We had built up so much trust over time, however, that they were willing to put their faith in the board in that respect. It also required holding an empathetic space for our board, who ultimately had to make the decision to approve the new name. And for my part, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, strapped to a hang glider for what seemed like weeks, while the board sort of patiently and thoughtfully worked its way through their process. There, of course, are 1,000 reasons not to jump when you're at the edge of the cliff. But of course, eventually they got there, and I was ready to jump with them, take that leap of faith with them when they did. It also required holding an empathetic space for our community, many of who criticized us for taking so long to change our name, or for jumping on the politically correct bandwagon in that moment, or for making the most stupid and moronic decision imaginable. The dust is settling now, however, and the Museum of Man is no longer. We're now very proud to be the Museum of Us, and it has put a lift in our wings in all sorts of ways as we move forward. And perhaps most importantly, the process required that I really hold an empathetic space for myself, because at times I struggled mightily in my own ability to hold such a space for so many others, and even lost my nerve at times. All said, though, it was one of the most rewarding and challenging messy and beautiful experiences of my life, and we did it. There is a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that I think a lot about and I repeat often. And that was when Martin Luther King said that, quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice," end quote. And of course, it doesn't always bend at the pace that we want it to bend. And it doesn't always bend in the ways that we want it to bend, but it does bend. I have no doubt about that. It bends towards justice. It bends towards a greater good. And I believe it bends towards love. I also believe that the work of the Museum of Us is to support that bend. I think that the work of every nonprofit is to support that bend in some way. And I think that the work of every church, every temple, every mosque is to support that bend in some way and to stay loyal to that process. And I think that whether we realize it or not, every one of us as individuals is here on this earth to find our gifts and our unique genius, and to use it to support the arc of the bend in the ways we know how. I think empathy is really the energy that animates the bend. And it's that path toward equity and inclusion that allows us to lead from wherever we are positioned, by holding a space for and trying to create conditions to bring out the best in each other and the best in ourselves. Now, as we move forward as the Museum of Us, we are really thinking globally and acting locally. Our goal is to continue to try to work towards creating industry-leading practices in the unique landscape that we are on through our decolonizing and anti-racism work, and really become an exemplar that is finding its way through the mess and the muck, to do better as we know better, as Maya Angelou says. Similarly, we hope to extrapolate that localized place-based work in a global sense to be a part of a movement toward decolonizing in the museum industry, and within other contexts, so that this movement can continue to gain momentum and build critical mass until these are the kinds of questions that every institution, no matter where they're positioned, in what sector or industry or context, they too are sort of thinking about what does this kind of work look like within their own context, as I know you folks at St. Paul's are very much doing as we speak in this sort of marathon toward equity and inclusion. Being in such close proximity to you folks, we hope that this is just the beginning of a long conversation of us all supporting each other in this work as we move forward. And with that, I would love to get your reactions and thoughts and see if I can address any questions that may have emerged during the course of my talk. Thank you, everybody. Yay. Does anybody?
Wow. Wow, what a journey, and what patience and courage you have all shown. I'm just blown away. I'm pinging with resonance about the church all over the place, and I'm sure others are too. Is the Museum of Us an outlier in this, or is there a wave happening?
I think there is very much a wave. There are a small group of museums, and you know, this is work that Native and Indigenous and peoples of color have been doing forever, right? They just haven't been listened to. And I mentioned earlier the idea of, you know, it's easy to put up a Black Lives Matter statement, and there are every museum has now sort of done that in one form or another. but very few have sort of begun the kind of excavation, institutional excavation necessary, and started to unpack the demons that are sort of in their histories, and start to find ways to truth tell about those and be honest about it going forward. And in many ways, it concerns me, because it's one thing to sort of talk the talk and create an expectation that you will start to authentically engage in this kind of work. And yet, I think a lot of museums and other organizations don't yet have the tools in their toolbox to begin to walk the talk. And we only know that because as we started to talk the talk many years ago, we realized the same thing, and we had to start to build up those tools in our box. And we made a lot of mistakes, and we fell on our face, and we perpetuated harm, and we continue to do so. But we're getting better, and we're learning more and more. So there are a group of museums that are going down this path and are committed, and I think it's just a matter of time before that critical mass evolves into more of a mainstream sort of approach. And to be honest, I think we're getting close to it, but there's a lot that has to happen in the interim.
Right. Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, again, thank you for that very elucidating talk, and just commend you for all your efforts. So what happened to the indigenous people in Balboa Park? What's that, initially back in 1915, and have they been able to be integrated, or what's the progress or setbacks in that integration process?
Of course, back in the day when the Kumeyaay inhabited this land alone, there were no borders, right? They, as that map indicated, moved freely in this area and sort of stewarded the land according to their subsistence practices. And through the colonial endeavor, that land base that they called home was contracted more and more over time. And eventually they were pushed out of Balboa Park and everywhere else, and situated on reservations. And now I believe there's 12 bands of the Kumeyaay Nation, and they each have their own sort of reservation that is situated throughout the original area, but marginalized to parts of our community that are not as fruitful or valuable as we say. So for example, the reservation isn't in La Jolla and Point Loma, where I live, and Mission Hills, right? It's pushed east, where that same sort of value, although that is also part of their traditional homeland. So I think that it was just a step in the process of pushing them into the reservations. If that helps, Barbara.
Have you read Mirror for Man by Clyde Kleckholm?
I haven't, although I have read other things by Clyde Kleckholm, a very famous anthropologist who did research, I believe, on the Navajo Nation, where I also did my field work for my PhD. I'd love to hear your take
Yes.
on it and why
Mirror for Man explores the concept of race, and that was back in the 50s. I met him in Cambridge back in 1955, and very interesting man. The idea that that race is a social construct is not new. I mean, even back then, there were books about it.
We have Elizabeth and then Jocelyn.
I grew up with the museum, and I remember in junior high coming over with a girlfriend, and we would listen to recordings of indigenous groups of people from all over the world, and felt that it was a very expansive experience when we were young. Later, and I can't tell you when, my view of what the museum stood for and what it had been up to all the years that you talked about, Micah, was changed when I heard a Native American, I think he was a Kumeyaay. He must have been a Kumeyaay. He was an artist, and he had set up an exhibit within the museum. You must know about him, where all of the dioramas of Kumeyaay people were all around him, but he lay down on kind of a bed. He was a live person in the midst of all this, and he endured the public gawking at him and coming to the realization that he was a real live human being. And he spoke with great passion and of course a lot of anger. And my view of the museum started to shift at that time. And I can't recall what year that would have been, but it was telling and quite an artistic statement that he made.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I love both those points you bring up. The first was sort of back in the day, hearing Indigenous recordings, and that being a very sort of eye-opening, expansive experience. And that was the kind of thing that the museum did all the time, without really thinking twice about it, that we had the right to do that because it was a process of education. But there were a lot of really important questions back then that we didn't ask that we would ask today. And that is, is it okay with the group, whether it was the Kumeyaay or some other Indigenous people, to share those recordings? Were they sacred, perhaps? Had there been permission? Were they getting some sort of recompense for, from an intellectual property perspective, while the museum was benefiting? How were they benefiting? And so now, as we go down those kinds of paths, we really start with the question with our Indigenous partners and say, what do you think about this? Or how would you like us to share, or would you even like us to share? And so it begins with that sort of trust building process. Your second point about the gentleman who became part of an artifact, I'm so glad you raised that. It's fascinating. His name was James Luna, and he was a Luiseño, so sort of a counterpart to the Kumeyaay in this area, performance artist. And he did exactly what you said. He had some cases with, his high school diploma and a medal he had received in the Army and his track shoes. And these were the artifacts. The exhibit, in fact, was called the Artifact Piece. And then he would lay down in the case itself, and people would come see him. It was a mind-blowing moment for the museum, particularly one that had been down this very traditional path and had a huge impact on the subsequent future of Native arts. And we are, in fact, looking at the possibility of bringing an exhibit curated by an Indigenous artist out of Santa Fe about the sort of before and after this artifact piece exhibit and the ways it influenced future Native artists to really speak truth to power and turn things on their head and challenge assumptions. And I'm so thrilled that you were able to see that.
What year would that have been, approximately?
I believe it was 89.
Oh, that far back. Wow.
90. Yeah. So I wish I could have been there. And it blows my mind that the museum hosted that. I don't think they had any idea what they were getting into. Recently, that piece was identified in the New York Times Magazine as one of the top 25 protest art pieces over the last 50 years or something like that.
Wow. Well, I'm glad I saw it.
That's so cool.
Jocelyn, did you still have a question?
Well, I had a comment. And first of all, Micah, this was a wonderful talk. My husband, Ken Gary here, who has illustrated, co-authored, and edited many books on the Hopi Indian, volunteered for many years at the museum, whose name we will not complete. But I thought your talk was wonderful and very insightful. And just now, we touched on another aspect, inadvertently and almost unconsciously touched on another aspect of colonization. We referred to a group of Native Americans as Luiseño, Diegueño. Again, those are Spanish names applied to groups based, I guess, on the names of missions that were established near where they lived.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and indicative of how complicated it is, right? And you line up a group of Indigenous people, and they will give you, a wide variety of answers about what they would like to be referred to. And I think a really important remark to make is that we all live in a colonized world, right? Including Indigenous peoples. And I'll tell you a brief story. We've been partnering with the Kumeyaay for many years now, obviously, in an effort to rebuild that trust. And there's a gentleman named Mike Conley who has been involved in us in giving presentations on the work we're doing. And he is Kumeyaay. He's a scholar and historian, and from Campo, and very respected, a tribal council leader. And he tells the story of coming to the museum, and he always felt really uneasy with the outdated Kumeyaay exhibit that didn't have any Kumeyaay input, and it was a frozen static representation of a people frozen in time as a result, and that we displayed sort of sacred and ancestral remains in the exhibit and that kind of thing. And then he said that he would go into the Egyptian gallery and he would just look at the mummies and the shrunken heads, and he thought that that was just the coolest thing ever. And he said that he realized how colonized he was, that when it applied to him, he was offended, and rightfully so. But when it was pertaining to an other, it seemed perfectly okay, and it didn't even dawn on him. And so, our words have power, language matters. And, I often think of it as what I've heard referred to as the platinum rule. The golden rule we all know, do unto others as you'd have others do unto you, which I think is critically important. And to next level it, the platinum rule is to do unto others as they would like to be done unto, and you don't know until you ask. And I think it's okay to ask. These are times when sometimes we're so afraid of misstepping that we just don't say, hey, what would you like to be referred to? And I'm confused about how complicated this is, and can you help me out here? And of course you can do your own research as well, and that's probably the best way to start.
We have a question from the chat from Jasmine. How is the process of working with Indigenous groups going? Have you returned many belongings and artifacts?
The process has been complicated, as you can imagine. You don't just say one day that, oh, we really want to partner with you now, and you should trust us. For years, we kept kind of showing up, and they just didn't believe us. There wasn't a track record of goodwill that we put in the bank, and in fact, quite the opposite. It took us just years of continuing to kind of hold space and say, no, we mean it, and to show that with our actions. And gradually, we have built up a great deal of trust, although it is very fragile. That traumatic legacy and the harm that we did as an institution to the Kumeyaay and other Indigenous peoples is still very raw and still very much at the surface. So the process over the years has sometimes been 1 step forward, but 2 steps back. And we have returned many of the ancestors and have really put that, prioritized that. Excuse me, I'm gonna plug in my computer before I die here. We have returned many of their belongings as well, and continue down that path. So our focus has been on the Kumeyaay first, and we've made significant progress, but they're always questioning our motives and sort of not believing that we mean what we say. So it's up to us to constantly show up and really back up our words with actions.
I believe Jocelyn, did you come back, and did you want to ask your question now? I think she was having some technical difficulties.
I'd like to make two comments. One is that I grew up in San Diego, and it wasn't till I went away to college that I met the first local member of a tribe here. And I was just amazed because somehow it never come to my consciousness that these people were still alive. And I was later surprised to find that I think San Diego County has one of the largest populations of Indians in indigenous peoples in the nation, but I'm not positive. I just had read that one place. So that was a great joy to get to know one of my friends who in college who was Indigenous. The second is I was mentioning a family story of an event that happened at the Museum of Man, the museum, now the Museum of Us, a year or two ago when I was visiting with my niece in New York, and she has two young school-age children, and they said, the Museum of Man, what are you talking about? That's cutting out a whole group. And so, you know, they were young and they took offense, and it was quite an education to me because having grown up with that, it had not dawned on me other than reading the articles in the newspaper. And so I think it's a very positive change. I'd like to commend you for it. And also having recently seen some anthropological programs on PBS when they were talking about actually dinosaurs and things, that some of the national parks and historical monuments now have indigenous people as the rangers, and it's really a wonderful thing, and because they bring their own history with them, and that I found it very enriching, and I really think this is a very positive step for us all to make. And I think that perhaps the commonality we feel now that we all have the danger of COVID is very helpful in making some of these transformations.
I just really quickly wanted to say thank you, Micah, for doing this hard work, and it's amazing. It's really a great leadership for the country to see high up organizations making changes, and I really respect the thought that you have taken, and you know, even from the facade of the building, right, understanding what the outside means and what people bring inside with them, you know, like how it makes them feel, and then building a trust of getting, you know, of really understanding everyone in your board and before the name change, you know, really getting trust. And that just it speaks a lot to the big organizations out there that need maybe a role model, need someone to look at where it's been done, and it's, you know, very inclusive now. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I would just say right back at you folks, because that you all are taking this work on as a community and a leader here, and really a model for others to emulate. And, you know, it takes one to know one. So thank you very much for saying all those nice things. But you folks are looking in the mirror and doing the same work in your own way in your own landscape. So thank you to all of you.
It gives us a message of hope, though, that you're able to change people's attitudes and behavior.
Just speak up. So I saw a couple more hands. I know we're over time. We can maybe, Mike, if you have 5 more minutes.
Absolutely.
Do you have? And if folks need to go on to get ready for church, please do. And I saw Connie and then Ken Gary.
Yeah, Connie.
Micah, I want to thank you for what you've done for the city. You came from a law practice to take on a job at the museum when it wasn't in a good place. And then you stabilized it, and then you have gone on to do so many things that needed to be done. And I admire you because I know it wasn't easy, but thank you. for what you have done.
Thank you, Connie. That's really lovely of you to say. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Ken.
I had a question about what I got involved in at the museum right after I retired from federal service regarding NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. I was involved in that right at the beginning, using a personal laptop to try to identify all the items that the museum held that might be subject to repatriation. And I just wondered to what extent that act still has on the museum's operations.
Yeah, wonderful question. So NAGPRA, as you mentioned, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which essentially, it was passed in early 90s, and essentially it requires museums and other institutions that receive any federal funding to return affiliated ancestral remains and certain types of cultural resources. The history of NAGPRA was a real turning point in terms of forcing institutions to sort of reckon with the problematic aspects of their collecting practices over decades, if not centuries, where many of these items were acquired under very untoward circumstances, where the playing field wasn't level and they were sort of raped and pillaged and taken and stolen and all the rest. The challenge with NAGPRA was, while it did have certain requirements and it forced museums to sort of pay attention for the first time in a different way, there weren't a lot of teeth to enforcement. And so museums like the then San Diego Museum of Man sort of complied technically to some extent, where there were a lot of kind of vagueness and loopholes in the law, but didn't really comply with the spirit of the law, and were able to kind of obscure and obfuscate sort of what was really going on the ground. That has changed to some extent, but there's no funding associated with it, and it requires a lot of resources. And so we just decided over the last few years through our decolonizing initiatives that we would just make that a priority. And we've started with our NAGPRA eligible items that need to be returned. And that has been first on the slate. But our colonial pathways policy that I mentioned is sort of like NAGPRA on steroids. So it doesn't have to be an ancestral remain. It doesn't have to be a ceremonial affiliated item. Basically anything that came to the museum by way of a colonial pathway. And that is most of the cultural resources we steward, because when you start to peel the layers of the onion, you see that the context was always a colonized one that inflicted a lot of harm and was very unfair to Indigenous peoples. So NAGPRA is a big part of what we do today, and it will continue to be as we go forward. But we also hope it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's a problematic law in some ways, in that it only applies to federally recognized tribes. And there are many Native American groups that are not recognized either federally or by their respective states. And so they don't have those same rights afforded legally. And for us, we've decided that that doesn't matter. We're still going to honor their perspective and evidence and engage in this trust building and consultation process.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Micah, for being here today. If you are participating in Sacred Ground, you will get more taste of what Micah has highlighted for us today. Micah has shared with us one of the museum's virtual exhibits. He showed us a slide of the facade of the California, it's the California building, right?
That's right.
Of the California building, and the Museum of Us has put together a virtual exhibit that Micah has shared with us that explores the conquistadors and priests that colonized this area. That is part of our curriculum for session 5. So if you are in the Sacred Ground group, you will be using that virtual exhibit as part of your curriculum for session 5. If you're not in Sacred Ground, reach out to me and I will be glad to share that virtual exhibit with you. We're also hoping, Micah has shared with us that he has some other virtual exhibits coming online later, and hopefully, what is it, the 2021, the race exhibit comes on?
That's right.
So we hope to share more of those with you as the museum makes those available. I, for one, really am excited about the work that the museum is doing. And I want to support it as much as I can. If we want to support the work that you're doing at the museum, Micah, how is the best way for us to do that?
Great question. I think deepening the hug, you know, coming in when we can reopen, looking at our online resources. We've got all sorts of wonderful information about our decolonizing initiatives and our land acknowledgements and our policies. And I think you'll find them very interesting and sort of enable you to connect with the work in new ways. To continue to have an open heart and an open mind and to spread the word about the work we're doing, and to create that ripple effect in your own worlds. You know, you all are entrenched in communities that overlap and that are your own, and would love to just, you know, continue to kind of help you folks see the Museum of Us as a resource as you continue down the path of your hard work. And of course, you know, membership and financial support is always welcome and allows us to continue down the path. But what we really want to do is build an ongoing relationship with you folks so that, you know, we can learn from each other and the mistakes we make, and share those learnings and what successes look like, and sort of, you know, broaden our community to include all of you folks. So I look forward to continuing to that process in the future, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Micah for being here today.
We'll be honored to be in partnership with you.
Lovely. Well, thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend. Stay safe and gobble, gobble.
Gobble, gobble.
Gobble, gobble to all. Next week, we begin our Advent series with David Mosley, who will be doing a series on the biblical narratives and sort of a tour combined with a sort of virtual tour of the Holy Lands. So stay tuned for David Mosley beginning next week. Thanks again to Micah, and we'll see you all in church in just a few minutes.
And the Alternative Gift Expo is now live.
Yes, it's online this year. So go to our webpage so you can find out more about that.